Hi, this is Dr. Scott Young, and today we're going to get in the stealing of NESARA. And we're going to talk about 2008 and 2009. Coming right up. So what I want to do when we get into this, by the way, hey, if you could like, subscribe, share this with your friends, it's really, really helpful for me. So please like, please subscribe. I just appreciate that a bunch. Okay, I don't ask much of you guys. That's what I'm asking of you. Okay, so I want to show you some issues. Okay, and we're going to talk. This is going to be 2008, 2009. It's in there too. What happened in relation to these idiots? And we're going to show you some interesting points that kind of come out here. Okay, let me pull up the screen. I want to show you something. This has happened to me. I mean, dozens and dozens of times. I mean, I have on my Firefox. I use Firefox, and don't worry about it because I could do that with any one of the Chrome or any other ones. But the search engines are killing things. This is this is on the FDIC page, which is the federal deposit area. This is where you would have deposit insurance up to $250,000. And there was a conversation about what I had written down is I had said this is an old, it's a historical timeline of the Fed, and yet they've ripped it off their site. Guys, you don't understand. You talk about, like, some people get mad at me, like, because they haven't seen everything. They haven't seen some of the stuff where, and they're going, well, I can't find that anymore because they've taken it away from you. You don't understand. They've taken a ton of this stuff away. So I want to kind of go over a little bit of that background of that 2008, 2009 crisis. I'm going to start you off with a conversation. And we happen to be living in Denver around, the late 80s to, or sorry, late 90s to early 2000s. And I grew up in the Denver area, and my wife and I moved back there, and then we had our son out there too. Okay. So I remember, I think we were buying this house in 2003. It was a mistake of a house. We should have stuck with the one that was in it's south of Littleton, called Highlands Ranch, and we had this one house in '99. It was actually great. We moved into this other one, in 2003. Spent a lot more for it. It was a bad decision. Ben, all of us make stupid decisions, okay? But at the time frame, we're going through the financing of it, right? And so the guy's talking to us about financing, and I had great credit at the time too, and still have pretty darn good, but especially at the time frame, a really good credit. And so I remember talking, and my wife and I kind of looked sideways at the guy because he was talking about something called an arm and these 4-year arms. And so I'm like, what the flock is that, dude? And he goes, well, it's like you're going to buy a new house, and just like you did, right? And what you do with this arms is it's just an insurance, excuse me, an interest only payment. So you have like a 3-year or a 5-year arm. And I mean, the interest is really tiny. So if, make up a number, if you were paying $2,500 a month, $2,000 a month, whatever that number might be, you're going to pay like less than half of that price, because you're not taking any principal out of there. You're just doing it toward interest. And so what they go is like, let's say your house is worth $200,000, and then it grows in value and goes up to $230,000 value. You buy a new house, you roll that $230,000 plus your amount that you put down upon the house, right? And you roll that equity into the new house, or you refi it or whatever, but you get great interest only payments. Now, it sounded like a great idea at the time, and I remember, like, And then it hit me. And I mean, when my wife and I both get the hitting of the spirit, it becomes a shock. And I just look at her and she's got to stare back at me like this, like, we ain't doing it. This is exactly what happened for us. We were like, no, no, no. Those arms that were in 2000 to 2004, and then they kept coming up, right? But they hit, lots of them hit around 2008. And I remember asking this question: what happens if someone goes from that, you just say $2,500 payment, and it's now $1,500 payment? And what happens if their credit goes bad or they lose a job? I literally asked that question. And the guy was like, oh, well, you can refinance it. And he really didn't have any answer. And that's exactly what happened in that time frame. Exactly. And you go, why did that occur? It's because they were trying to screw with everyone in the world. Let's show you an example of this inside of the monetary crash. So the 2008, what happened? What happened? And it was the worst economic points from the Great Depression. So this is done like about 10 years later in this article. Obviously, everyone's freaking out. So let's give you some of the highlight points that happened out there. Horrible circumstance that happened in the beginning of 2008. Now remember, Bush Jr. is in office, or W, right? And it goes to Obama. So by the way, it encompasses both of those idiots, right? It really does. So what happened, and it talks about why had the vulnerable 158-year-old investment banking firm bulwark of Wall Street. Why did they go down? The Lehman Brothers. And we always like blame it on the Lehman Brothers. But basically what you have to know about that time frame is they were doing something like this. What they were talking about here is the banking losses. And there's a friend of mine named George Taylor, and he's actually on my channel. And he was my boss years and years ago. And he was trying to teach me some business concepts and some sales concepts that I did not. I was rejecting everything that he thought. And only years later did I realize that he was right, about all that stuff, right? And so he's way on top of this stuff. His words were just ringing in my ears the other day as I was ready to kind of think about researching this. And this is probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And he was like, okay, consider this. I'm going to bring it off the screen for a second. Consider this. So you have a 5-acre plot. Make up that, right? And let's say you have and it's just a tiny little plot. Now you have your neighbors all around you have these 30 to 100-acre plots, right? And they're farmers or ranchers, right? And you are just a small time, kind of nothing. You're just doing it for yourself, right? So you have some of your stuff and you're just trying to be self-sufficient. So what you do is that you're investing. This is part of this insurance investment. You're investing that your neighbors are going to go under. And so you put a percentage of investment of an under to them. And you invest in every one of your neighbors that they're going to go under on a certain percentage. And you have a stopgap to this. And you're going, okay. And then those neighbors get in the game too, because now they're voting on their neighbor too, that which one of them will go out. But they have an insurance process for this. They're not hoping that the neighbors go out, but they actually buy an investment insurance from their neighbor about their neighbors. This is exactly what was happening in the banking crisis. So what they were doing, this is the evil of this, is they were giving loans to people who could never afford it. It was way too easy of credit. And by the way, that same thing is coming to roost in 2020 because the cabal wants to do it that way. So they were giving away immense amounts of credit points to people who literally had no ability to pay for this back. So they couldn't, it's not that they couldn't afford the $1,200 payment. Just use my example a minute ago. They were never going to afford the $2,200 of the real 30-year fixed mortgage. They were never going to be able to do that. So what happens is they come to the end of their 4-year arm, 3-year arm, 5-year arm, whatever, right? And like in 2003, and if I had that 5-year arm, and let's say I stayed in Denver, but let's say my paycheck went down in half, which could have easily occurred because let's say the business was dying, and I'm like, I can't afford that. And here's what happens: even if you didn't refinance, it wouldn't just go up to 2,200. It might go up to 2,700 because now you got interest on top of that, and it was a bigger chunk of interest because they could refi it for 30 years after, and they weren't refiing in good terminology for you. And so what happened? People just went, boom, they're out. Now we actually moved away from Denver in the middle 2000s, before this crisis ever occurred. And so we bought this one house, stayed in there for like 13 years. And because we were like, I don't want to move anymore. I don't want to make mistakes. And we watched that crisis go through, and our house almost never grew in value at all. Tulsa is very, cheap area compared to a lot of other places, right? But my house didn't grow in value almost at all. It sometimes went a little bit down, but we didn't care because we were just taking care of things, right? And yet, most people just said, well, I can't do this. And so they just dropped the keys in the mail, basically. And so there was foreclosures everywhere. And those banking, those credit insurance points that I was talking about just went through the roof. And they were like, okay, so what do we do? So they came up with a concept called quantitative easing. Okay? So how does that work? So basically, what would occur in there, and this comes from the Fed and supposedly the policies of the government with that too. Now remember, Volcker, I'm blanking out his first name, in the late 70s or early 80s, when Reagan would say something about monetary policies, Volcker was really powerful, the Fed chairman at the time. It was like, I don't care what he says. And he didn't say it that way, but basically said, I don't care what he says. We're the ones that make the monetary policy. And it was a real faux pas for him to actually say, but it was full on truth with that. So it isn't the government that did this. So what they were doing is taking those mortgage-backed securities, those insurances I was mentioning to you, and what they did is they bundled those puppies right up. And so a form of monetary policy which a central bank purchases the securities on the open market to achieve the desired outcome. Now, here's the thing. If you had that, if you were stuck in the middle of those mortgage-backed security points, that you were a bad risk. You were a C level risk, not an A risk, maybe a C or whatever level risk. I mean, you should never have been able to get into that house. So now you're going through foreclosure, which probably brought you to bankruptcy. You might have lost your job. Then and even at the time, how are you going to rent a place? Because they're going to do a credit check. It destroys your credit check. And then around that same time frame, credit checks came out for rentals. Like if you're renting a place. So you couldn't even get in a place like that. So you're living with your parents. You're living on the streets. I mean, people with great jobs and great circumstances were overreaching because they were dumb on their credit issues, right? And I've been there and being stupid on my credit. And so what they were doing is trying to ease it, but they were supposed to take that easing and bail out the people. So what happens in here is this first part of the QE1, the quantitative easing 1. And it says that it stopped the recession. And that's just bogus because it never did anything like that. So what happens to that QE1 is the Fed bought up $500 billion of these mortgage-backed securities and other horrid debts. They shoved them inside Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Now, if any of you remember me talking about this, and I'm going to bring this up here on the screen. I just hadn't thought about this, but it's a pretty powerful point that I want you to see here. I'm just bringing up the one there that I had. I want to show you this. Pull this up on the screen here, so I got to remove this. Sorry, this takes me a second. This actually came to me. Let's make it a little bit bigger. This actually came to me in 2020. Fannie Mae, and I knew this, and this is related to this 2008 thing, right? So in 2020, I refi the house. I get 2.75. It's like the lowest rate I'd ever seen in my life. And they were like, it's called a note of assignment, sale, or transfer of your mortgage. I had literally never seen anything like this. Now, your mortgage gets sold all the time, right? When you pay XYZ mortgage broker, whatever, they don't own that thing. The local bank, more likely than not, on those suckers don't own that either. They're just a pay-through company, right? And so, they're making a portion. They're actually, in essence, a debt collector. It's so powerful. Your thing is already in debt collection by the time the mortgage broker takes it over, and you have great credit, which is part of the steal of the systems. Now, this little thing comes in line here, and I get this, and I started talking to people, and they're like, oh, that's kind of common. It's not uncommon. I'm like, BS it is. It's not common at all. What it says is that Fannie Mae bought Scott's house. You don't pay us, you pay the mortgage broker. Well, I'm like, no, duh, you idiot. Sorry, let me go back here and we're just going to go through that one. But no, duh, I know it didn't pay for that loan. Let me pull this off here again. I know they weren't going to pay me anything. I mean, that I was going to work with them to pay my loans. But here's part of that circumstance. So in that time frame of 2008, they were taking those mortgage-backed securities and they dumped it into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So these were guaranteed kinds of things. And so they dumped it on the Fed. And those are the toxic debts. One of the points that happen with the Fed is they take toxic debts and they just swallow them. And you're going, oh, poor Fed. And that's how they try to tell you. But what they don't tell you is that they have all the assets. Yeah, it's 600 billion, but it's 600 billion of overinflated assets that they didn't have to pay a dime for, could turn around, give it back to their Fed bankers because they're part of the Fed bankers. So Chase and Capital One and all those other idiots got to come in and own those houses, those tens of thousands into millions of houses, right? And you have all the houses and they could resell them free and clear. And you're going, whoa, wait a second. And not only that, they gave them money, honey. They gave them tons of liquidity. And so this is some of the sickness of the liquidity that came. So then we come to this thing called the bailout of that time frame. There was $634 billion. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more here in a second. Because what we're going to talk into now is we're going to talk into that TARP agreement. Okay? And it was based upon the Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae kind of stuff. So the TARP agreement comes out. And this is part of the bailout that they, repackaged this thing. This is a second level of this. And so they said, well, we're going to give $634 billion and the inflows are 743. So you're going, well, outflow is this. So they're basically saying they're losing about 1.1 $110 billion. And that's bogus because they didn't have They didn't have any gains or they didn't have any other assets or financial points to do it. They just got the debts. They could forgive the debts, which, by the way, they did. But they threw it on your credit to bankrupt you. This is the steal that they do. So they bankrupted all of these things. They swallowed the bankruptcy without taking any of the personal responsibility to this. Then they tell you that there were 900, almost 1,000 recipients of that $635, right? Or $635 billion. So what the TARP was is another way for them to get out monies, right? And encourage this system. And they said that, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are still part of the Fed. Okay, so they're still subsumed into the Fed. That's why my letter was so powerful. I hope you're sticking with me, guys. You got to do this slow. But what they did is they were able to take this and they were making amounts of revenue upon it. They're making 580 million net revenue. They were pulling out this kind of stuff with this. And I know you're kind of seeing it. You might disagree with me on this, but here's what they did. They talk on this, all this other stuff in here, but it isn't even possibly the truth. Because what happened here is the bailout banks gave millions to the execs. Now listen, if you get bankrupt, if you're going through a bankruptcy as a business, and I'm not talking about bankruptcy closure, we're talking about bankruptcy reorganization, because at that time frame of 2008, they were trying to take away from the people. Now I'm going to explain this a little bit more in just a minute, but basically we're trying to take away from the people a huge amount of stuff. What they did, if you were in that circumstance, you don't get to pay out bonuses to your execs. How sick is that system? But here's what they did. They paid out $5.3 billion in bonuses. They gave out bonuses. 738 employees were bonuses at least $1 million per, even after they lost $18 billion. If you were going, wait a second, you gave out $738 million of bonuses to people who failed at their job, even though you're on top of losing $18 billion. So I'm going, where do I sign up for that one? Right? This is how corrupt they are. And the SEC was a part of it. It's all the sickness of the system. Bank of America received $45 billion in TARP money, paid $3.3 billion in bonuses. 172 employees get $1 million each. Merrill Lynch, and I'm reading this here, Merrill Lynch gives out $3.6 billion. And they were criticized for this. And then they said, well, we paid it all back to the Fed. And my response to that is ridiculousness. Because here's what happens. I'm going to remove this from the screen. That did not occur. What you're going to find out now, I'm going to throw this one at you, because I remember hearing this in 2011 from my White Hat contact. And I didn't believe it. And it's taken me years. Now, this is part of the conversation that I had on this book called Revelations of the Red Pill. You can read this a little bit more. But here's what occurred. There was 83 trillion that was brought in by the White Hats. Scott calls them the anti-cabal. They were brought in to release NESARA to the world. Now remember, in 2001 at 9/11, by the way, 9/11, the false flag, what they did is they had monies and they took at least $3 trillion. We don't actually know how much they actually really took, but we know the Pentagon took $3.1 trillion on 9/10 of 2001, and they announced it, but they took $83 trillion. They took that money, and because the only way to send in the money was through the Fed. And you're going, well, how do you do it through the Fed? Because every monetary transaction is from the Fed. How is that? So I was having a problem with my bank, right? My local bank, it's not their fault, necessarily their fault. But I want to tell you that my local bank was telling me the story just today that this is a bill pay circumstance, right? And I do bill pay all the time. So I go online, into the bank and pay out these, pay out the debts, to the mortgage or, gas and electricity and blah, 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 right? Because I like to be able to write it down. When I pay it, I want to write it down on my check register so I can go into Quicken and reconcile the checkbook, right? So I want to see it. But when it goes EFT or ACH, I have to go search for it all the time on the line online, and it's a pain in the rear, right? So I like to have a little bit more control than they're just automatically taking it out. Okay, this is a Scottism, right? So I find out that they're payments aren't even going through. Payments that do go through get stuck somewhere. We're having all these kind of problems. They had just revamped the system. Catch this. August of 2023. What happened in August of 2023? That's when the BRICS released their point about their gold-backed currency, because this was the first level of when the banks had to start becoming Basel III compliant. So now we're seeing glitches in the system. And by the way, lots and lots of people are seeing glitches in their system because only in the very near future, this month of March, we're going to see the banks have to fully engage into, as a 6-month period of time or 7-month, whatever, period of time where they had to fully engage. And if you were not Basel III, you're not Basel III compliant by the 15th, you're out of business. Okay. Let's go backward. In this circumstance, what happened is $83 trillion come into America. It comes into America through the banks. It comes in by your checking account and your routing number. Your routing number, they will tell you, is just to identify your place of circumstance. Your place of, your address kind of thing. But that's just bogus. If I take any particular loan, this is my water bill, okay? I'm not showing you here. My water bill. And my water bill from this place in the Tulsa area, they will have, it says it's called a payment coupon, right? And it has the account number. How do I identify it's a water bill to this? Well, there's an address. This is how we actually identify things, right? And everyone else utilizes account numbers, but only in the banking sector do they add this thing called the routing number. And they're lying to you about this approach. This is how they stole the money. This is how the DEA, actually, when they find drug dealers, this is how they pull money out of their accounts or they seize accounts. It's because of the routing numbers. So they admit it on one side that it's a good thing, but they don't admit it on the other side. But in 2009, $83 trillion was stolen from the anti-cabal. And here's what they were told. We will give it back to you if you will back HRC, Little Hillary. Wait a second. So Bush is here, goes 8 years. Obama here go 8 years, right? From 2008 to 2016, because that's what their plan was. This is what they do to the ELECTIO, right? This is how they mess with your VOTER issues on fraud. This is what they do to it. I have to spell it out for you guys. And so their plan was to move into the Hillary thing. And I remember hearing this in like 2012, 11, 12, 13. And I'm like, I didn't believe it because I'm like, we're in the middle of Obama. What are you talking about? I had no idea that they're talking about Hillary. I'm like, Hillary, she's just a senator. I mean, is she really a senator? Is she really, what was she really doing? Didn't she just get in because of Bill? And, there's all kinds of stories about that conversation. But this was part of the plan, and it comes through the Fed. So they really took $83 trillion. And what they did is took that $83 trillion, and Obama blocked it in 2011 in the World Court. This is why the World Court has to be released. That they've taken over the World Court. They have to legally release that money. So it's not just having the cash, it's having the deed. Like if this was your deed to your house or your car, they're having the deed to the corporation so they can change it to a constitutional republic. This is so amazing when you see this. So when they got screwed out of this point, let's bring this back up on the screen, they moved into something, and you see the time frame of this. Bitcoin starts coming out. It's called a cryptocurrency. It was a digital asset backed upon, there was all kinds of little mining things that they would do to accomplish it. So it had some backing. It's one of the first ones that ever had a particular amount of backing. It's where we come up with the concept, and they were building this thing called the blockchain. So you could identify where every single cent, in essence, went to, right? Every single point of Bitcoin that would go through. And they talk about this is the creation. I want you to see this. The creation is August 18th of 2008. That's an interesting time frame, isn't it? Think about that for a second. Why are they creating it around the same time when you have a crash occurring? Because they had a plan to come up with central bank digital currencies. And it was supposed to release when Hillary got in 2016. They would have had all of your assets moved into that situation. So 2016, they had this plan because they knew in 2020 there was a bankruptcy event occurring. So they were building out this little thing, and you can read about this. And I'm just using this. In 2010, they talk about the first transactions, the open source code on a cryptocurrency. Now, let me explain what currency means. Currency is a form of transmission of something that is valuable for something that is a product normally. So if you're going to buy this book here on my drscottyoung.com, it's called Foretold. It's a $17 book. Now, the form of currency that exists in America today is US dollars. Now, obviously every nation has their own kind of thing. Actually, when I sell my books through Amazon, I actually get payments different ways. I'll see it from here's from UK, or here's from Australia, or whatever, right? It's real interesting how they actually deposit the amounts in the account, right? And you can kind of see it when you look at it. So I can see the different currency points that were done to purchase that kind of book, right? Okay. But cryptocurrencies was the first time they introduced this digital form that would be an accepted currency. It's a type of fiat currency that doesn't have any necessary value. So I'm going to pull this off the screen, so we'll just talk here for a second. Sorry. So what happens in this circumstance when we see this Bitcoin coming out is it trying to be a replacement of the fiat, because the fiat they knew had to come to an end some point or another. They had to create a bankruptcy. Now, they did the first one. I mean, they had a bankruptcy event in 2001. It turned into all these wars, and the wars just kept going on and on and on and on, right? And you always kind of say, what was our end goal in Iraq, right? They never had one. They never have had one. They just want to be there so they can keep stealing the abilities or the assets of that country. That's what they do, right? And so at the same time frame, they're creating this thing called Bitcoin. And it's real power. Now there's a whole bunch of other cryptocurrencies that have kind of shown up in there utilizing a blockchain kind of thing. XRP, all kinds of ones, okay? But Bitcoin was how they actually did a lot of the trafficking. And what you don't understand, this is how they take money from the Fed and it's given over in this Bitcoin kind of way. It's really kind of sick thing. At the exact same time, the anti-cabal is going, you know what? If we can't put our money, if we can't put that $83 trillion I just mentioned to you here, if we can't put our money through the Fed because they're going to take it, we've got to come up with our own system. So they created this thing called the QFS, the Quantum Financial System. And they were building it and building it and building it in 2008. And they were building it for a long time. It's kept under wraps. And I'd heard about this, that he didn't use the terminology of QFS. It was just an alternate route at the same time that Bitcoin was coming out. And now from 2020 on, we've heard this term called the QFS. Now, the QFS is not a crypto. You can't buy QFS yet, okay? Don't ever buy crypto QFS from any idiot, okay? Don't do it. Don't say that Scott told you to go buy it because someone's faking my image, okay? Do not do it, okay? That's my irritated point there. The reality is the QFS has a point of crypto inside of it, but it's only for, but it has to be under constitutional means, which means they have to use the treasury, which is going to have a US note backing it under gold. So treasury to US note, the US note is gold backed, and it has to be replaced, the dollar has to be replaced 1-to-1 with a US note. And the quantum financial system is to track all of this stuff. Not just track, and even digital notes. So if you had $1,000 in the bank, that is digital, right? If you have $1,000 in an investment, it's a digital kind of thing, right? It's not physical. So they have to back all of those things. That's why you don't get to open the accounts. You think that you've been told to go and build a cryptocurrency, and that is wrong. It's already been done for you. Just like Experian Credit Report is already done for you. It was done for you. You are already identified. Now, there are going to be people who are not even in any kind of banking that they'll have to identify later on and put them in legitimate people who are in the system. Okay? Not these illegitimate stuff that you see all the time, which is why social media has so many illegitimate people. I mean, you see people like famous people, and they have 27 million people on their Twitter page or whatever, and you're like, how many are real in that Twitter page? And the answer is very few. But inside of the QFS, what it's going to do is it's going to flush out a lot of the social media stuff, because it's going to identify those that are real and those that are fake, right? And by the way, on every single channel out there, mine has 63,000 on my YouTube channel. I know that there's fakers in there, because they're bots that come onto my channel to try to identify things that I'm doing, and then they offload it and pull it into another channel. So there are bots on every single channel that you'll ever see, and we never know exactly how many bots are there. Now, some people have done some analysis and find that, these channels have just ugly amounts of bots. But what I want you to understand is that this issue of the 2008, 2009, the banking crisis, was all to create a system to steal the $83 trillion that was coming in. And they covered it with a false flag financial event. You can watch on things like Too Big to Fail. And they talk about it, and they talk about this in a really nice fashion, right? And how nice that they were, and all the Fed bankers were. We don't want that money. It would make us responsive to the government. If you watch Too Big to Fail, you're going to look at it and go, you got to watch it, by the way. Those are real interesting movies. And as you watch Too Big to Fail, it's near the end of the movie, and it says, they're all sitting around a table, and Wells Fargo and a Bank of America, all these ones, and we don't want the money. It'd make us responsive to the government. No, they already are. They already are part of the whole system of the Fed. They bought into the Fed. They are the Fed. There's no difference. And they're the money drivers of the whole system. They're the thing that stole that $83 trillion. And so the White Hats had to create something called the QFS. It's not Mark of the Beast. It's going back to a constitutional backed money where in the first article under the 10th section, you pay your debts with gold and silver. Donald Trump set up Executive Order 13818 to say that if you have crimes against humanity, we're going to block your property. And that is a type of bankruptcy. And that bankruptcy is for the idiots. The bankruptcy isn't for you, even though many of you have been fighting through this massive amount of inflation going on. It's because we're trying to, they are trying to bankrupt the idiots. And yet, unfortunately, you're involved in that. I mean, you have to deal with the pain of that. All of us have dealt with it. There are many countries that are sitting at 175% of inflation levels. Morons try to tell us that we're at 3% inflation. I just saw a statement over the last 3 years that there's maybe as much when you look at real pricing, which is really part of inflation. And when you look at gas prices, which are supposed to be a part of inflation, you're talking about 25 to 40% increase in pricing. What? I mean, prices have actually, many of those things, especially houses and cars but not as much cars, but houses and insurances and school loans or amounts that you go to college with have way outstripped inflation. They've been way massively overvalued to the point where no one can really afford that kind of stuff. And that is part of the sickness of the system. So I'm trying to give you some understanding, I'm trying to give you some ideas of what really happened with 2008. When you realize it, and you're going to see it later on, it's not going to be the first thing you're going to see on EBS, but when you see it later on, you're going to find how sick this quantitative easing was and how they created the TARP and bailout system for themselves. Then they stole that money and took it out and gave it to the execs. But what they really stole, instead of 563 billion or 700 billion or whatever number you want to come up with, 700 billion is possibly the number. What they really stole is $83 trillion. And there was actually a $49 trillion amount that was given for the world. But the one that was stolen is the $83 trillion part. Now, right now, at this point, we're sitting in debt levels of, credit debt is sitting at about $137 trillion in overall debt. So when we talk about debt, that adds in the Fed debt of 34, 35, whatever it is. It goes up 100 trillion every 100 days, totally out of line. No one can afford that kind of debt. That doesn't include, the around $100 trillion of debt that people are in. The debt situation has to be released. It's because that's what you always do when you go into a new currency point. And especially when you go back one, you have to release out the fiats and the fiat because you can't pay back the idiots. So trying to give you a full picture of that. Hope that helps. On my website, drscottyoung.com, you can go actually and download, I think it's a 14-page outline. It's free. You can download, just put your name and email, and you can get that for you. You can donate it if you'd like to as well. I really appreciate it. I don't ask for anything else. I don't do any advertising. I also tell people all the time, do not buy that idiot QFS crypto crud. That is a scam from the pit of hell. I tell people all the time. People claim it to me all the time as if I did it. I didn't do it. Never buy that stuff. Okay? Hope that helps you out. Like and subscribe as much as you can. Thanks so much.